The first years of the 21st century were filled with reforms that shaped public schools into what they are now. Schools are still undergoing constant reforms, with the objective of changing public education so that it meets the needs of a world that is constantly being redefined by technology. But we keep expecting public education to be changed by adding reforms to the first blueprint of public schools, a blueprint whose origins we tend to forget. During the late 1800s, when the U.S. was starting its period of industrialization, it was common for factory owners to hire children over adults since they were paid lower wages. This left thousands of adults both enraged and unemployed. Between the 1840s and 1880s, a huge wave of immigrants settled in America. It was also during this time that transcendentalist thinkers, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, started to plant the ideas under which alternative schools would flourish. Transcendentalist thinkers believed firmly in individualism, in limitless potential, and in thinking for yourself and not letting anything but yourself define who you are. Throughout the last quarter of the 19th century, industries multiplied like never before, opening jobs for the thousands of immigrants they had established in America. By 1900, traditional schools had become the common practice, and only 18% of all American workers were under the age of 16. It was also during this time that many alternate forms of education were established. Maria Montessori opened her first school for children in 1907. Her teaching method, that would later spread worldwide, consisted of endorsing initiative and responsiveness in children through the diversification of labor and a copious amount of freedom. Each alternative school was built upon the values and principles of its creator. Public schools were built upon the needs and ambitions of industrialization. In 1918, public school was made compulsory at a national level. Schools had three sole purposes: keeping children out of factories so adults could work, installing a sense of citizenship in children which would unify a country of immigrants, and creating obedient, productive, interchangeable workers which would sustain a good economy. In the 1960s, alternative schooling systems boomed into a social movement. Between 1967 and 1972, over 500 alternate schools were founded. This was mainly due to student demonstrations, teacher strikes, and a deep questioning of traditional assumptions becoming increasingly popular within the public. During this time, many writers such as Paul Goodman, John Holt, Jonathan Kosel, Herbert Cole, James Hernon, and Ivan Illich wrote books criticizing the public system of education. They believed that schools were killing individuals to create masses of people who had been taught to repress their own dreams in order to help others build their own. Throughout the 80s, the clamor alternative schools started in the 70s began to die down. Legislative activity during the 90s was centered on raising academic standards and holding schools accountable for student performance. Legislative activity during the 90s planted the building blocks for a culture of standardization. Standardized tests are a crucial tool in education. They allow us to measure how much students are learning in particular subjects, but that is merely what they are, a tool, not a finality itself. The first years of the 21st century were filled with reforms that shaped public schools into what they are now. Schools are still undergoing constant reforms, with the objective of changing public education so that it meets the needs of a world that is constantly being redefined by technology. But we keep expecting public education to be changed by adding reforms to the first blueprint of public schools, a blueprint whose origins we tend to forget. The principles and values on which public school is built upon need to change. An embrace for curiosity, diversity, and personal drive should replace coerced compliance, standardization, and dullness. We shouldn't promote the fear of failure, and we shouldn't define failure as the antonym to success. Unwillingness to learn from failure is the antonym to success. We keep speaking about innovating schools, about building great structures over weak foundations. We must readdress the objectives behind public schools, and we must reassess the ways in which we are achieving them. We can no longer continue to innovate schools hoping that this will change public education. Innovating schools will not change public education. Recreating them will.